Hello, welcome to Film Trace. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from production to conception, all the way to release and reception. It is, I guess we're not doing episode counts, so we're just like, is this volume 2? Are we even counting episodes, Chris? What are we doing?
I do not think we used the word volume once when we recorded last.
Because I keep on thinking about them as volumes in my head.
I don't know, man. Whatever you want to call this. We are tracing the evolution of the self-aware horror film, and this is another iteration of that. We're looking specifically at the early 2000s, late 90s, and we're doing the anniversaries. So this year, the year of our Zombie Lord 2022 is the 20th anniversary of none other than Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later. It's also the 25th anniversary of Scream 2. So we'll prepare you with quite a discussion about 28 Days Later, and then we'll also try to tag a little bit about Scream 2 at the end, especially because we're going to get even further into the Scream franchise when we discuss the new version, Scream 5, whatever you want to call it. But before we get too deep into Horror Town USA, we have a guest with us. I would like to introduce Riley to the show. Thanks, Riley, for joining us on Film Trace.
Hey, it's cool. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Introduce yourself a little bit. I mean, we have obviously a couple mutual friends, and we've become friends over the years. But you, in particular, I tapped because you do kind of a project with a friend of yours, and I had heard that one of your recent big watches was the entire filmography of Wes Craven. Correct?
That's correct. Yeah. So I've got a friend who lives in Pennsylvania. I lived in Pennsylvania for a few years. And he and I watch movies together from afar. I'm still in Minnesota now. And we just kind of, chat or text or whatever while we're watching movies. And we pick a few directors or through different studios or something every year. And then we go through those films in chronological order. We do 1, 2, 3, or 4 from each director each month, depending on, how large their filmography is. But yeah, Wes Craven was one that we did last year. So I'm pretty fresh off the Wes filmography, I guess.
Nice.
Did that watch make you love him more or less?
Oh
no, my hero.
No, the films that are strong for him were strong.
Yeah.
But then there's a lot of not strong films.
yeah, a lot of filler. He was a
parallel to Danny Boyle, possibly, huh?
Well, yeah. So that was going to be my follow-up question. Riley, have you ever done a deep dive on Danny Boyle's filmography yet?
He's one that I've coming up actually scheduled for next year. I've scheduled out for a few years here on this.
Oh, amazing.
Because I watch at least 1 or 2 movies a day now. It's kind of like how I get through all these. I was kind of looking through his filmography to see how many I'd seen. I've seen somewhere between half and 60% of his movies, I guess.
Yeah.
But not, I haven't done a deep dive on him. And the nice thing is a lot of these directors I have seen most, or in some cases all of their films before, but it's interesting to go through them in chronological order and also to spread them out over a year. So I'm not just binging one director, I'm spreading it out and kind of, processing each film afterwards. So it's kind of a cool way to do it, I think.
Yeah, totally. Well, yeah, I'll be interested to hear how the Danny Boyle watch goes. He's another guy. We're going to get into it here. So I'm going to throw a bomb into it right away.
I love beginning bombs.
I think, tell me if I'm wrong, I think 28 Days Later is still his best film.
Okay, the only other option would be Trainspotting.
Yeah.
Nothing else is even close. Nothing else. I mean, The Beach is obviously a mess that's going to become a cult film, obviously. And we all know this. Yeah, I don't. Riley, what do you think? I don't know.
It's not that controversial a statement? Yeah, Riley, what do you think?
No, yeah, I would agree with that pretty wholeheartedly, actually. The ones I've seen, it would be the top of my list,
Yeah, I think it's got to be his best one, which is kind of, I think, I find that very sad. You know, he's had so much opportunity and a lot of resources. Let's be honest. Like, and he's had, you know, a platform to say a lot of things. But what he said in 28 Days Later, still to me, and we'll get into it, still kind of stands the test of time.
So it's interesting that you said you phrase it like that, Dan. What he has to say, but essentially, the impetus for this film, I mean, if you from Danny Boyle's perspective, anyways, because he obviously did a lot of collaboration with screenwriter Alex Garland, who created the characters and a lot of the details of the plot. But am I right in our research? It seems like essentially Danny Boyle says like a lot of people have road rage. And then that turned into a seminal zombie film.
Well, I mean, like the source of all these characters in this story is without it. It's Garland. Like,
yeah,
I don't think Danny Boyle did a lot here in terms of the characterization or building the plot. This seems like a lot of it's Alex. And you look at his other movies, Ex Machina, Annihilation, the stuff that he's doing. This is him. It feels like his story. It feels like the type of characters that he would write. Right. It has that tone, right?
Yeah. The only Danny Boyle film that has his name on the screenplay is 127 Hours, which is,
you know, I've actually never seen, so I can't say anything about it.
I mean, I like it, but it's definitely not. It's something that's, you know, like a classic bravura performance and set piece, and that's about it. Like, but I mean, it's pretty paint by numbers in terms of like, you know, adapting. I'd imagine like a hopeful autobiography.
I mean, how hopeful is it?
I mean, yeah, it's survivalism, but that's our connection, I think, and I think that may be a running theme: survivalism versus exceptionalism in his filmography, including with his other most famous film, Trainspotting, and, you know, drug addiction, and Steve Jobs, a different kind of I have a temptation to also call it a zombie film of another variety. But I don't know what. I think you're right. What do you think, Riley? Do you think that when you consider this movie amongst Danny Boyle's others, does it feel like it fits with him? Or I don't know if you're how familiar you are with Alex Garland, and like Dan said, I think the only two titles that stand out to me from his filmography, especially as he became a director, are Ex Machina and Annihilation.
Yeah, and I've seen the former, but not the latter. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that kind of surviving, not thriving theme, because that does seem to be kind of a recurring or ongoing thread with him. I mean, Sunshine is another one that's literally like the extinction of humanity.
Yeah, and that's also Alex Garland screenplay. Yeah,
right. Yeah. That's true. Yeah. So that, but no, I think that's true, that there's an element of like, I think even in this film, they say something to that effect, you know, is it Naomi? What's her character's name?
Yeah. Selena.
Yeah. I mean, early in the film, she's talking about, I don't want to get too far ahead, but she's talking about like, you know, it's all about survival. She does change her tune. Later on, literally like, totally reverses what she said, but I do think that's a kind of a thread through Boyle's films. Millions is another one, like the kids that find that money that's about to be, you know, destroyed or whatever, and what they do with it, what they want to do with it, and the different characters want to do with it. Like that whole surviving versus thriving comes into that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's Slumdog be thriving, right?
Yeah,
but surviving then thriving.
Right. I mean, it's interesting that it took us so long to get to Slumdog Millionaire in Boyle's filmography, because that's, you know, probably what people most know him from, because that's the only Best Picture nominee, much less winner, that he's directed, correct?
Yeah. But I mean, like, you look at the film right before 20 Days Later, which we're kind of cheating with the 2002. It came out in the UK in 2002. It came out in the US in 2003. But I think we're fine.
Yeah, and it was filmed in 2001.
Yeah,
The Beach, which is written by Alex Garland as a novel. Incredibly depressing.
I don't remember it at all.
Movies I've ever seen in my life. He's a dark guy, and it fits with I think in one of the notes that I had, it's like he read the first 4 pages of the script. He's like, I have to do this. I have to create this post-apocalyptic wasteland of London. It's almost like he was meant to be. What I'm curious about with this film, and kind of talking about like what it means and its stature, did you guys come, me and Chris, I know your history with it, but let's maybe, brush up on that a bit or explain. I mean, this was, when this movie came out in the United States, my favorite movie, and like was my favorite movie for a long time. I think I saw it 4 or 5 times in the theater.
Wow.
It was massively important to me, so I'm incredibly biased when we're talking about this film. Chris, I think you're probably the same way. Riley, I would love to know what your background is with this.
I saw it in a theater with my then girlfriend, now wife. We went to see it not when it first came to the theaters. I think we saw it at a now defunct theater in Roseville. It was at some shopping center that's not there anymore. But I liked it right away. And I'm trying to think what my Danny Boyle experience was before that. I mean, I'd seen Trainspotting.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably it. I'd probably only seen Trainspotting of his by that time.
And what was your reaction to it in the theater? Like, did you know that this was something hugely awesome, or were you kind of more just like generally positive, and over the years kind of realized how good it was? I don't know if you did a rewatch recently like we typically do.
Yeah, no, I actually watched it twice recently, but it's been probably about a decade since I'd seen it last.
Oh, wow.
But no, I loved it immediately. And it was so, I mean, I know Boyle does not want to call it a zombie film, but it was so different if we're characterizing it as a zombie film versus Apocalypse, which I'm sure will be part of the discussion later. But the zombies are so different than you'd seen in any previous zombie film. Like even the way they moved, and the idea that there's still a person in there.
Yeah.
Which I think really comes through. And I thought, I just loved it. It kind of blew me away. Early 20s at the time. I think I was in college. So
right.
It was the right movie for me at that time, but I still like it now.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Like I remember we and Chris and our friend Ryan, who's been on the show, we had a debate about the movie. Do you remember this?
Oh my gosh. In Joe's basement?
I had like index cards. We had a debate about the entire meaning of the movie. And this is when I was like 20 years old.
And here's where we're going to blow things up again. I think the sticking point ultimately for that debate 20 years ago, I'm not sure how vicious we're going to get today in our late 30s, but essentially it was the theatrically released ending versus the alternate ending.
Yeah, I think so. And I was arguing for the alternate ending, right?
Right. And I was arguing
I still argue for that.
And I still argue for the theatrical. Okay. Yeah. Cliff Notes version. We cannot spend the entire show on this. Explain to people, trace for us what happened with filming and then ultimately releasing the theatrical version of the ending to 28 Days Later. So at this point, we should also do spoiler alert.
Yeah, obviously spoilers. If you haven't seen it, go see the movie and then come back and listen to our wonderful show.
It's streaming on HBO Max.
So here, and I found out some new information as I was doing research for this episode that I did not know before. So in the original ending, this movie ended actually when they crashed the car through the gate. That was the original ending. They ran out of money in the production. They went to Fox and said, "Hey, this is our ending. What do you guys think?" They're like, "No, absolutely not. We're going to give you some cash and you're going to go film a new ending." So they went back and they filmed, I believe, 3 endings. So the theatrical ending is the one you see. It's actually shot in film, in 35 millimeter film, which is the only part of the movie that's shot in 35 millimeter. Right. It's beautiful. It's crisp. It's in the Lake District of England. And essentially they get saved and all the characters survive. In the alternative ending, which I loved, which they did actually release in the US theaters, I think it was like a post-credit scene. So if you stuck around, they put on the end of the movie. Jim dies. He dies in the hospital, and Selena and Hannah, I believe her name is, they get saved at the end, but Jim's dead. He's actually replaced by a chicken who they call Jim. So those are the 2. One, and actually I believe, and I might be wrong here, so the nerds might come after me, The last ending, the one that I actually prefer, is Jim dies in the hospital and it shows Hannah and Selena walking out of the hospital together and then it fades away. That was my favorite ending.
Explain why.
I do not think the world that is depicted in this film does not deserve a happy ending. And I don't think, I don't think the ending that comes about really kind of makes any sense either. Because there's a whole, I could go, it's a whole long thing. Well, number one, the virus would have spread all over the world instantaneously and everybody would be essentially dead.
So in the alternate endings, there is no, or there is reference to still, I forget the soldier's name that, reveals to Jim that they're a diseased island. Is that?
Yeah, that would still be part of it. But
it would be more like written off as like a delusion.
Maybe. Yeah, that's a good point. Good point. Touche. But the film in of itself and how it depicts human nature, that to me is the ending that fits. And it's the ending that would have resonated more and freaked people out more. And I think it would have actually given the film a higher stature than it has now. The happy ending's fine. I enjoy it.
So what you're saying is if it actually stuck with the original ending, COVID would have never happened.
Something like that along those lines. Although, I mean, we have to address the elephant in the room, right? Like, it's a pandemic movie, and the entire concept of this film was built around a virus. And there's like a crazy introduction or interview with one of the cast members, and they're basically like, yeah, like when I was younger, they'd always tell me like a virus would take over the world and all this sort of stuff. And it's so interesting that, I don't know, he like hit the nail on the head to some degree. About how bad it would be, maybe. I don't know. Is that a fair assessment? Do we feel like the cynicism, which is very clear in this film, do you feel like it's accurate?
See, I struggle. Here's the other part that I struggle with, and I'd be curious for you to break the tie, Riley, and help us finally make a decision on this. What is the point of having Jim as your protagonist and he clearly not only represents the everyman but also the idea of goodness and justifiable defense and protection of sacred life as he becomes kind of a different form of rage-induced Avenger in the film's climax against the soldiers. It seems like, yes, the cynicism has been prevalent throughout the film, but then I feel like that ending would make way more sense if Jim was a part of the problem. And I guess that depends on how you interpret that kind of rage-induced vengeance at the end. Is that seen as, noble and good, or is that seen as, once again, part and parcel of the problem of quote-unquote rage? I don't know. How do you read the ending, Riley? And do you have a preference? Did you even know about the alternate endings?
I did, yeah. I watched both of them, and you'll probably mention later there's the storyboarded one too, but that's a different piece.
Yeah. What is the storyboarded one?
What's that? What
is the storyboarded one?
It's not only just the ending, it's like the whole last third of the movie is different, kind of, because
really?
Yeah, they well, not to get into too much detail. The split is where what's his name? Brendan Gleeson's character, the dad, Hannah's dad, gets the blood in his eye and starts changing over. Like, they actually save him, and they do this whole like convoluted blood transfusion thing, and it's there's this whole other character in this like hospital, or I can't remember what it's not a good ending. I'm glad they didn't go that route. But to get to your initial question, I'm actually going to offer a third option, and even though Fox didn't like it, I wish it would have ended with them crashing through the gate. That's the point, because again, you have this ambiguity, I think, about where Jim is at that point in the film, and you could look at it as like he's this heroic, Avenger, as you say, defending what it is that he's defending. But he also has, there's a moment earlier in the movie where his first kill of infected is a child.
Yep.
And so you kind of get this little waver in your impression of Jim early on. Not like you turn against him, but you're like, oh, what's going on? This person's infected, but it's still a kid. But then his whole like assault at the end, I mean, he's killing these rageful military guys who have these dark intentions, but they're not technically infected. He unleashes this thing on them, and to the point where both Selena and Hannah think that he, has the virus because he's so full of wrath and rage in his attack. The way he kills that last soldier, very, very, very brutally.
Yeah. Little thumbs in the eyes.
Yeah, and then he goes and gets that really passionate kiss with Selena with his hands.
Yeah, that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
How that relationship is treated.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I think the ambiguity of where we are with Jim, I like them crashing through the gate, and we don't know how what's going to happen for any of them. It's not like a hopeless ending, but it's also not very hopeful. Like it's just. It seems to be what the situation is, whether they're in quarantine, like our quarantined island, or if this is spread out throughout the entire world. We don't know, other than we did see a plane, I think, at some point.
Yeah, there's a plane when they're in about to get shot, I think, or something.
But we don't get that whole ending, the happy ending that's, like you said, beautifully shot, and it makes us feel good. But you could also, I mean, are we interpreting that at all like it might have not even happened? Is that in anyone's, like, do we?
That's conjuring some memories about that. Did we have an argument about this, whether it was a dream or not?
It's quite possible. I mean, I feel like Fight Club fucked everything up for interpreting endings of films.
It is shot so differently,
right?
Like he clearly made that choice for a reason.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't. Yeah, that's a good point. I had never thought about whether it just ended when they ran out of money, essentially, and they're like, oh, I don't. It kind of does really work, suspended in midair, essentially. That's kind of cool.
You might have cracked it, Riley. I think that's a really good justification. And I mean, the other thing that it kind of makes me frustrated, as we were discussing, like Danny Boyle's quote unquote style or common threads throughout his career, is like, I don't know. He's never quite, for me anyways, stepped up into like the level of auteur. And that choice feels like it would be a very like auteur choice, like a very much like bold and, art house kind of ambiguity, that if you're a dude that has, gone across the pond and is now making movies for Hollywood and trying to basically do good after having two really bad bombs in a row, not only The Beach, but also A Life Less Ordinary, the year after Trainspotting. He's probably doing whatever he can to stay on the good side of the studio execs.
Yeah. And it kind of brings to a point of like they purposely shot this for like £6 million, whatever it is in the US. Because he said he wanted freedom, right? He wanted the freedom to tell the story exactly how he wanted to tell it. He did not want studio interference. Of course, they ran out of money, neither did the studio. But yeah, there's sort of there is an element here of just he had a couple of not so great movies that didn't do very well at a very high profile stage, and then he's like, let's get back to kind of the DIY almost level of filmmaking. It feels very, I mean, the movie feels very indie. Am I wrong in saying that? The use of the Canon DV stuff?
Man, I'm glad you brought that up, because I cannot put into words how differently I felt about the DV shot style back then versus in my rewatch today. Because I have not watched 28 Days Later in I think at least 7 or 8, maybe even closer to 10 years.
Sure.
And there was something about that style, that grainy, just like, I mean, deliberately kind of shitty quality that didn't sit with me as well as it did back then. And I hate it. I don't know what it is, because it, like, I like the concept behind it. Are we just in like a weird period now, like 20 years later, where like that doesn't quite make sense for a feature film, but it did back then because it was like not only a new technology, but also a new kind of technology that still kind of harked back to like almost found footage style, like Blair Witch.
Yeah. I mean, it looks almost like it looks more 90s than 2000s to me. The look of
Yeah.
it. And it's interesting too. One of the points that they bring up and talk about making this movie is like they could not have made it without those.
Sure.
Because they literally would have like 12 people with cameras, shut down London Street for 20 minutes. They'd get all the coverage they could get in that 20 minutes and move on and have the streets open again. So it's like the film couldn't exist technically in its current form without that sort of very mobile, easy to set up technology
portable
of DV. But yeah, it looks terrible. Riley, what do you think about the look of this movie?
Yeah, so I mean, I think they kind of tried to retcon this a little bit. I think it was just a matter of practicality. It was cheap and it was, like you said, very portable, and they're doing these complicated scenes and they wanted to stay on the good side of the police and whatever other officials are helping them clear the streets for these really complicated shots. And then like just the mobility of the camera within certain tight spaces too. I think it was a practicality thing. However, I do like it. I mean, and I remembered it looking like that in the theater and each time that I've seen it, but I think it works, and maybe they're trying to claim it's intentional now, but because this is all framed around, I mean, we start on news footage, right?
Yes.
And we start with, this is at the turn of the century, millennium, wherever, and this is before, like, everyone had, I mean, HD TVs were barely, I don't even know if they're, I mean, we had like those flat screen TVs, those big tube flat screen TVs then. Yeah. And so when you're watching the news, that's what it's going to look like on the cable news. Mm-hmm. And this kind of has that quality. And that you said, you pointed it out in your notes that they did deliberately style many of the images from the film, some of the more, impactful images over actual images from photographs or, television of actual atrocities that happen throughout the world. And so I think it gives it not just like the found footage quality, but I feel like it almost feels like it's mimicking that news, 24-hour cable news type of image too. Like you're kind of a voyeur, almost like a photojournalist is out there taking, this footage, but not interacting with their,
And I also got like, especially, I don't know if this registered with me back in earlier watches, but like that, not only you're right on with like the local news vibe, but also like CCTV, right? Like surveillance state, especially kind of, it does, I think, especially highlight those really desolate shots.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's something to be said for like going against what your intuition would be, and any noob off the street would be like, okay, if we're going to get a big landscape shot of Big Ben and there's no people except for one human, you would want to, make that as crisp and beautiful as you want. But by going against the grain, pun intended, you're going to have this kind of like discomfort that you're supposed to be feeling because you're watching seemingly the last man on earth, and you've got Godspeed You Black Emperor blasting in the background.
Tastings. Oh my God.
Right?
Right. Well, it's funny why you said that, because I didn't put this in the notes, but I remember reading this today, that the use of DV, that was one of the sort of goals, was to make it look like you were viewing the apocalypse through like a camcorder, essentially, like on the news. I think Boyle said that in one of the interviews. But yeah, I mean, that's really a fascinating kind of viewpoint on that. And yeah, it makes it feel kind of real, right? Like we're watching something actually unfold.
But Boyle is still, for all of my drags against him, like he's still able to do some really beautiful compositioning. The almost Manet-esque field of flowers.
Oh my God,
and the like framing of the tunnel, like any sequence where the zombies run up, right? It's like perfect. The camera's perfectly positioned so that they just come out the corner, and also like the sound design where it's just like silence, but then interrupted with that extreme like L-cut loudness that you wouldn't expect when it comes. I don't know. It's just a really, I mean, what was going on? I wanted to make sure to ask this in the context of our overall theme for this collection of episodes. Garland was very much inspired by, obviously, the Romero Dead movies.
Yes, heavily.
He was playing Resident Evil a lot at the time, but didn't want anybody to say that he was copying Resident Evil. So there is obviously some self-awareness here, but especially compared to some of the more in-your-face self-aware postmodern horror movies, like for the most part, there's no like wink, nudging in this film. It's heavily indebted to homage and past works, especially in the zombie subgenre, but it really is committed to pretending that it doesn't.
I mean, that's an interesting line to think about and what crossing that line means, because here, you look at the opening is essentially based on a popular British novel, Day of the Triffids, I think, and a movie in 1962, which I ended up watching for some reason. The opening mimics it almost exactly.
Really?
Then the last third of the film is Day of the Dead, essentially, by Romero. There's Dawn of the Dead, multiple sequences that are directly homage, I think is the right term. But I think, what is that line? You say there's no wink, but what really is the wink? Is the wink Billy and Stu talking about horror films at the end of Scream and why they're doing it? Or is the wink, are these visual and audio winks the same thing? I don't know. Well, it's kind of an open question.
Yeah. What do you think, Riley? I mean, I think I've implied enough that I don't feel enough of the wink, but I'm curious where you're coming from.
Yeah, well, they're kind of very narrow winks too. Like, I mean, it's not like, obviously those Romero films are popular films and a lot of people have seen them, but they're not choosing necessarily the most obvious moments to homage if they're wanting like a wide audience to get the reference. So it's intentional, but I don't know that it's necessarily conveying meaning to most of the audience. Something else that I thought, and I don't know if this is intentional at all, I was thinking of Hitchcock during part of this because of stairs, like the significance of stairs in this film too, like that one sequence where they're going up the apartment building and that really long stairway, that's like, Vertigo, and the church, this great moment in the church when you're going up, the camera is tilting up and you're seeing that message backwards about the end is very, effing night or whatever it is, you're seeing it backwards, but it's up the stairs again. So, and I don't know if that was just like not meant at all, but that was coming through to me subliminally. So I think there are things going on for a person who watches a lot of these kinds of films. They're going to pick up on that, but I don't know that they were meant to be this obvious, like, hey, pay attention to this type of moment. I don't know if that's really your question.
Yeah, I guess I'm interested in that. Now I'm bought into this discussion, right? This distinction, because when we talk about self-awareness, we're trying to define what that is as we're doing it, of course, in a typical postmodern fashion. When we look at a film, okay, how about this? Does this film work on its own as a non-parody? I think the answer is absolutely yes. Yeah. It's not a parody in any traditional sense, right?
Right.
Looking at a film, and we're always going to go back to Scream, because Scream is just the easiest touch point for everybody in this discussion. Looking back at that film works as a straightforward slasher and a parody at the same time, which is why I think it's considered so brilliant. Here, the elements of parody, Chris, I think you're right. There is no wink. There is no comment on the zombie genre, is there? Because what Garland is saying and what Boyle is saying is exactly what Romero said, almost down to the letter. there's nothing here, I think, from a societal commentary level here that's actually built all that much on what he was saying in Dawn of the Dead or Day of the Dead specifically. So I think in that sense, I don't, it's self-aware in the sense that it is steeped in film discourse and film history, but there's no self-reflexive and self-critical viewpoint happening here. Would you guys agree with that or argue with that?
The only reservation I have is, I mean, we're looping back a little bit, but two things. One, basically the idea. I mean, another story that's out there about the origin of this film is like Alex Garland telling Danny Boyle, like, "Hey, I've got an idea for fast zombies." It's just like, it's a silly way to like start making a $6 million movie, but whatever. Because it's a super important part of the movie.
Vital, yeah.
One of the reasons why it works and why it fits with essentially a modern retelling of the Romero films. Couple that with another big thing that I think Boyle has gone on record, and Garland too, in terms of being part of the inspiration for the film, especially not calling them zombies, and these are infected humans. There's no like death and resurrection aspect to these zombies. Is the proliferation of both mad cow and foot and mouth disease, particularly in England in that late 90s, early 2000s time period. So in terms of like that whole conversation of the world, moving faster, the paranoia over, an impending pandemic, and not to mention just like the general chaos of literally one of the only positive scenes from the film was filmed on 9/11. So like there is so much like societal baggage to this film, but I do think, while I disagree with a lot of your premise, I do think there still remains true essentially is that like this is, it's an update, but it's still like the very tried and true archetypes of the zombie movie, right?
Yes.
Riley, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I guess I agree to an extent. What I think is interesting about what Danny and Alex are doing is they've got all these moments of homage in the film. The zombie movies, I don't know if the Hitchcock thing was intentional, that's what I thought of. There's also another one that I thought of was the windmills, made me think of Frankenstein, which is,
sure.
another monster, I guess a monster movie. Maybe that's what they're going for. But they have all these references to horror. But I think if you ask them, they'd almost insist, not only is this not a monster movie, but Boyle especially would insist that this is not a horror film. Like he would say this is a, post-apocalyptic sci-fi or whatever.
Yeah, he kept calling it sci-fi in a lot of the interviews. Yeah.
Which I wonder if if it's going on inside of his brain and he doesn't know it, or if it's a deliberate, like, we're so postmodern about our horror, we're not even going to call it a horror. It's
Silence of the Lambs, right?
Right, exactly. Perfect for an example. But yeah, like he's gone beyond, like, the world is so horrific that this is not a horror movie. Like this thing being possible in such a imminent way, in a tangible way. And I had no idea how tangible it would be 20 years later. But and then insisting that it's not a horror movie when you're doing, press for it or interviews or whatever. I don't know if there's something to that, like him being so insistent about that, yet also they've got these moments that are clearly, a shout out to these horror films or monster movies or zombie films or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I'm looking out of curiosity. I couldn't think off the top of my head. I'm looking at the landscape of horror in 2002. And
rough, I think.
it's pretty rough.
Yeah, not a good time for horror.
Halloween Resurrection. Cabin Fever, Eight-Legged
okay, yeah. I kind of like that movie, but I'm not a good person.
Eight-Legged Freaks, Fear.com, and The Ring.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a wasteland, but also like The Ring is, even though I very much dislike the movie, it has
the Gore Verbinski one?
Yeah,
Come on.
I don't like any of
it. That's a challenge.
Okay, but it's yeah, clearly it has its defenders and it's become a mainstay. But I do think there is this kind of weird space that 28 Days Later fills, not only in that year, but in the landscape of horror, probably post 20th century in general, where, like you said, Riley, you essentially have filmmakers, especially filmmakers that want to be taken seriously, like Danny Boyle, trying to not necessarily, they're trying to disavow any connection to it, right?
Genre films, yes,
right. Like everything from like Eight-Legged Freaks is a joke movie, and Cabin Fever is essentially a joke movie, but then The Ring, like anytime you're actually trying to do like big horror that's not an outright like joke, then you have to have some kind of like melodrama to it or some supernatural element to it. It is a really strange outlier in the history of the genre.
It's not that surprising to me that Boyle is disavowing the horrorness of this movie. It's a horror film through and through. Like there's no argument against that. It's 100% a horror movie. It's funny. Maybe this could be a good segue into our chaser film, Scream 2, directed by Wes Craven. Wes Craven was famous for saying, and so was George Romero. They both said this. They said that horror is a ghetto, in the sense that like the genre traps you, and you get successful with Night of the Living Dead for Romero and Last House on the Left for Craven, and then Nightmare on Elm Street for Craven as well, where they could never get out of it essentially. And it's a disrespected genre in a variety of ways. There's never been a horror film nominated for Best Picture outside of Silence of the Lambs, which was a horror film too. So I think that might have to be, that there's some element of that there, where, he's already kind of a bigger studio director at this point. Like The Beach was Fox, wasn't it? That was a major studio release.
Right.
He does not want to get branded as a horror director because you don't get out of it. You end up making straight to DVD films in 2004, and then your career's over essentially. I think there's some element of that there, but I don't know. Let's should we transition to the Maestro's Scream 2?
Yeah.
It's like, talk about a movie that we haven't talked about Scream 1 first. We could never talk about that in this time that we have. But Scream 2, I think, is one of my favorite horror sequels. And it's a movie that wears its self-awareness on its sleeve, kind of like the first one. But I think the big difference for me in the second one is that it seems more rooted in a traditional horror film and kind of a whodunit film. And it works way better on that level than on the parody level. Would you guys think about that? Is that something that you would agree with, or what do you think?
Yeah, I don't. It's a tentative. Yeah.
Okay, I'll take a tentative. Yeah.
I will say, like, I do have really, once again, I hadn't watched Scream 2 for years until I did my rewatch just last night, and it felt kind of dull and blunted to me this time.
Wow.
I don't know.
Can you save him, Riley?
Someone convince me.
Don't throw me a life preserver here.
I completely disagree with you. Yes. this movie is great.
Down,
yeah, and I like this movie more each time I watch it. And I've seen it. I've seen it 3 times in the last year. So
explain to us why. What is the magic sauce here?
Well, as you said, you could take it as its own. People have problems with the reveal. Obviously, there's statute of limitations on spoilers.
Yeah, don't worry about spoilers.
People have problems with the reveal at the end, who the killer is. I mean, I have no problem with it. But even if I didn't like the ending, there's so much to chew on throughout the whole film that I just love. There's so much going on, and again, it's almost like I don't believe that. What's the screenwriter's name?
Kevin Williamson.
Yeah. I almost can't believe that it was all intentional because there's so many levels where this is working. I don't know. I mean, I've got a lot of things to say. I don't know. Is there a direct question before I like?
No, I want you to just go with it. Just wherever your thoughts take you, go with it, Riley.
Okay. Well, so there's all these surface things going on. You have the obvious. It seems silly and pat kind of with like Randy and Mickey debating like sequels. There's kind of this running gag about them trying to come up with a sequel that is better than the original. And there's all this like sub stuff about, oh no, well that's part of a planned trilogy and that doesn't work. And then there's like Randy giving the rules and that conversation about, sequels to when he's talking to Dewey in that malt shop or whatever, and kind of like raising the stakes and this anti-upping. But there's still like, it's still a good movie, and I'm going to stay with Randy because like his killing is fantastic, I think, in this film, because one, he's a main character that for whatever reason was kind of beloved, and it's like a sunny day, they're out in the middle of the quad or whatever it is, there's people everywhere, and then he gets yanked into the van, which is like a callback to the first film.
Yeah,
even though that's a moment that's something they weren't talking about, is like the callbacks, and there's a callback to the first film, which is another sequel element. But I'm looking at my Wes rankings that I did, because I always, of course, rank my directors when I'm done with them. And my top Wes films are basically the Scream franchise, Nightmare, and then New Nightmare. So the two Nightmare films, and then the Scream franchise. And Red Eye, which is ridiculous, but I still love that movie. But
Cillian Murphy.
Yeah, there you go. He's back. But Wes, like, you can almost look at like New Nightmare, especially, is like an allegory for, because it sounds so meta. If you're talking about like self-aware horror, he cast the characters from the original film to play, versions of their real life selves. Mm-hmm. Making another Nightmare film. I don't know. I think it's like a commentary on like the effects that making horror has on the people who make horror. Like and it's like Wes. I mean, Wes is in that movie too as himself, and it almost feels like I can cry for help almost. But but I think this movie works. Like, it works as its own thing. It works as a sequel and like a commentary on sequels, especially like this whole idea, is it superior to the first? I think I almost like it better than the first one for these reasons.
I'm gonna No, I've heard that before. That you're not the first person to say that. Yeah, because I think it really works. It's a very tight film, and you like thinking about the production of this. Remember, so Scream comes out December 1996. Bombs essentially an opening weekend. I think it like opens at 6 million. They get calls and Variety says it's a total bomb, and then word of mouth kicks in. And then by the time you get into mid-January, it's really rolling. By the time February, it's a hit by February, but it's 2 months later after it's opened. And so they released this sequel in December 1997.
Yeah.
So they didn't get greenlit for a sequel. I don't even know when it was. Probably March 1997. Their turnaround on this was insane.
Well, I mean, Kevin just, bought a couple 8-balls and then churned it out.
Yeah, I mean, it has that feel. To me, Scream 2 reminds me of like a player in sports just in the zone. And it's just like they can't do anything wrong. Like Craven's direction, it feels perfect. The script feels like super sprightly, if that's the right term. Like it just hits. I remember seeing this opening night, packed theater. There's people sitting in the aisles watching this because it was like so oversold, and it matched that intensity of the audience. Like it was like right there with us. And I think that's something that sticks out to me, is like, wow, this is a hell of a sequel less than a year later, essentially.
Yeah, it definitely has that slap together feel, like they were just throwing shit at the wall. But that's amazingly, that's what is so amazing about it, that it was a quick turnaround. They didn't even know for sure like how it was going to end when they started filming it, and then there's
the script leaked.
Yeah,
right?
this is like
Complete.
the internet's becoming, a big thing, and yeah, there's it's getting out there, and so they have to change stuff, but yeah, it's just amazing that it came together. Like that opening scene is so brilliant with them attending like the opening night of the Stab movie, which is like the Scream movie. It's very self-referential there, and then you have this terrifying moment, like everybody's having a blast and having a fun time, and then the people don't know that something bad is happening because it seems like it's part of what's happening. And again, that's going back, I think, to the commentary about like people making horror and thinking about the consequences of making horror, and you're having this fun, awesome thing that you're enjoying, but then suddenly you're like, oh wait, what am I really doing here? I think I don't know.
And I guess that's where.
Chris, where are we losing you here?
I gotta pipe in. I love the opening scene. The opening to Scream 2 is something that sets up for exactly what you said. And I think even more so than the original Scream, this concept anyways in Scream 2 very much harks back to New Nightmare, because not only that you have these kind of winks like that, but it's like it's almost direct. Like the killer is literally like trying to make a horror movie while he's killing. Mm-hmm. And the part that loses me, I guess, is everything in between.
The whole movie.
Like the beginning and ending, I'm all about. Maybe even not even just the ending, like maybe the lecture hall scene onward when Gail and Dewey realize that like somebody's been filming all the murders. Because everything in between, like, yeah, there's Randy, but I think Jamie Kennedy is pretty one note, and he's got a lot more energy and a lot less smarm to him in the first film. I really like. I mean, like, it's pretty amazing that like they got Liev Schreiber to play Cotton Weary in the first movie, and it's basically just like the beginning of him as a real actor, and he doesn't even, I think, really have more than one like speaking line on a television, and then he'd bring him in as a full character here. And so I think that red herring works very well generally in terms of, like you said, Dan, like the classic horror movie, just like doing things formulaically but super effectively and super economically. But other than that, like the kills just in general feel so unmemorable to me. There's the daylight scene with Randy, and he's a big character, but that's really the only one besides the opening that stands out. Like I had completely forgotten that Sarah Michelle Gellar is in this movie. Right. And she gets thrown over a balcony, whatever. There's this, Hallie's character gets stabbed in the chest. That is an effective sequence when they're trying to sneak over a knocked out ghost face in the car. But it feels fleeting to me. Like I'm still always going to go back to the original, and maybe it's just sequelitis for me. But I don't think it's bad. I think there's a reason I have not returned to Scream 2 nearly as much as I have the original Scream.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, I watched them all because of the series that we're doing, because I had to watch them all, and I watched them all in preparation for Scream 5 or Scream 2022. The original is so far superior to the other three. Like it's not even a joke. Like it's that good of a movie. Where it's just like
but Scream 2 probably is the second best. But I haven't seen Scream 4 in a while, and I remember liking that.
4, maybe. But I think thinking about like the one thing I think that works for Scream 2, going back to the theme of self-aware horror, is it's not as self-aware as the original. I think like watching the original again, I forgot how meta it was.
Yeah.
I just thought that got turned up really high in the sequels, but no, it's there in the original. Mm-hmm. Like it's right in your face the entire time.
And all the houses are just such excellent set pieces. And this is so clearly just like a quick mocked up fake college
2 colleges. I think it was 2 colleges that they filmed that actually.
Oh
so
my
yeah,
gosh.
it's not even. Yeah, there's not even continuity there.
It looks like I'm like, how is this not a soundstage? Because it really looks like
Oh, man.
I don't know if it. But maybe that's part of the appeal for a lot of people too. Like you guys said, like and I mean, scrolling through what the critics had to say it too, it seemed like there was a lot of division there, where it's like you get really buzzed about like that idea of the momentum of it all and like getting caught up in it, or you just fall off the ledge pretty easily. But I will say, like you mentioned, Dan, like seeing Scream in theater was an experience, but seeing Scream 2, it was like tantamount to like lining up to see Phantom Menace. So
yeah, it was quite the event. I mean, here's the big question, I would say.
Okay.
How would we view Scream 2 versus 28 Days Later in terms of stature? Right. I mean, to me, it's a clear answer, but I want to hear your answer first.
It's a tower. Yeah. 28 Days Later is a towering giant. Like, can we compare 28 Days Later to 28 Weeks Later? We didn't even mention.
Do we have to?
No, we don't. We can forget I said that.
Riley, you've seen 20 Weeks Later, right?
Yeah, but not since it came out. I haven't seen it since then. And yeah, I totally forget. I don't remember anything about it.
It was not an effective sequel. Like, I think Scream 2 was incredibly effective for whatever you want to say about it, but I think it really worked. Whereas 28 Weeks Later in general just did not have the staying power. But I think thinking about like self-aware horror and like the overall theme here, like 28 Days Later, despite the fact that it doesn't have a lot of those winks, I think, explicit sort of metafiction elements to it, way is so far superior to a Scream 2 movie. So I agree with you, Chris. I don't know, Riley, what do you think?
Oh yeah, there's no question. I mean, Scream 2, it's fun. I don't want to make it sound like it's my favorite movie, but no, yeah, 28 Days Later is far superior and far more like an important film, historically speaking, and in film in general. But no, there's no contest.
I remember Robert Carlyle in 28 Weeks Later, but I did Rose Byrne, Jeremy Renner, Harold Perrineau,
they're the main characters.
Imogen Poots, Idris Elba.
Yeah, you're literally naming the main characters.
I have no memory of anybody except Robert Carlyle.
Well, you remember he only lasts for the first 20 minutes.
Oh,
well, I will say this: the opening of 28 Weeks Later is.
I do remember that being killer. Yeah,
unbelievable. But the rest of the movie why didn't it work? It just does not have the. I don't think it has a social comment. It's an interesting point because it's actually a really straightforward thriller, and it doesn't work. As the original has so much homage to the zombie genre that I think this sequel just doesn't. And I think it's one of the reasons why it doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, Scream 2 is Williamson and Craven back together again with the cast. Yeah. And 28 Weeks Later is a whole new cast. Plus, while Boyle picked the filmmaker, he did. There's no connection otherwise. Oh, well. Thank you, Riley, so much for joining us. This was a really fun conversation about self-aware horror, 28 Days Later, and Scream 2. Come back next season. Cycle, volume, whatever you want to call it.
Happily, yeah, this is great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. This has been Film Trace.